Hello, dear friends and comrades. My name is Manuel de los Santos, and I'm the co-executive director of the People's Forum. On behalf of all our workers, receive a warm welcome to our second annual collective reading of the Communist Manifesto. Today, we are celebrating Red Books Day on the anniversary of the first publication in 1848 of the Communist Manifesto, written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. 173 years later, the manifesto still speaks to our hearts like the poetry of rage and rebellion. It sets fire to our minds with images and ideas of struggle that are inherently old, yet refreshingly new. It opens our eyes to the true realities of a world that is dying and a new one yet to be born. The manifesto is not an academic exercise devised by Marx and Engels to simply expose their theories. It arises from the need to explain to the world who we are as communists and what do we want. When the League of Communists commissioned this text, they were desperate for a manifesto that could both express the hopes and political energies of the working class. The final version, which was finished in the first week of February 1848 and was still hot off the presses as the 1848 revolution erupted in France and spread rapidly throughout the rest of Europe. The manifesto didn't spark these struggles, but it was widely circulated and read by those who had played a leading role or participated in the upheavals. With the victory of the Russian Revolution, led by Vladimir Lenin, it meant that the Communist Manifesto became an everyday tool of agitation that gathered revolutionaries in places often distant from each other. The manifesto's call to action and its specter of communism was now to be heard and seen in Cuba and the Philippines, in India and Vietnam, in Palestine and Morocco, in China and South Africa. Today, the majority of the world's population faces a great challenge. Conform to the established order of capitalism that is crumbling and is incapable of generating solutions to the crisis it creates, or fight against it in search of the liberation of humanity and the planet, and building a new life with dignity under a socialist alternative. Thank you for joining us today to celebrate with people from all over the world, Red Books Day.
Hello, I'm Danny Glover, citizen artist. In 1930, the great worldly American scholar and African-American social justice activist, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, wrote an article in the Crisis magazine entitled Karl Marx and the Negro. In the article, he states, without doubt, the greatest figure in the science of modern industry is Karl Marx. There are some people so afraid of his doctrine that they dare not study the man and his work. February 2021 marks the 173rd anniversary of the Communist Manifesto, published in 1848. So please join the People's Forum Red Book Day series reading of the Communist Manifesto by some of the transformative voices in today's world. Thank you.
Bueno, mi saludo a todos los movimientos de intelectuales, partidos comunistas y editoriales de la izquierda mundial que con motivo de los 173 años de la edición en Londres del Manifiesto Comunista se reúnen para celebrarlo con la difusión de la idea central de Marx y Engels. El Manifiesto Comunista, como se sabe, es el documento político, la declaración más importante en política de 200 años. Es un documento contundente, donde Marx y Engels exponen su visión del materialismo histórico y el desarrollo de la lucha de clases y del camino hacia el socialismo que la humanidad iría tomando como derivación de la lucha de clases. El materialismo histórico viene a ocupar un espacio fundamental desde ese momento del siglo XIX y lo sigue ocupando en el siglo XX. Sabemos toda la historia de batallas contra el imperialismo, la fundación de la Unión de Repúblicas Socialistas Soviéticas por Lenin y todas las batallas que se dieron, la Revolución China, la Revolución Cubana, la Revolución Vietnamita, Y ahora en el siglo XXI, las ideas de Marx y Engels por la humanidad siguen con una gran vigencia ideológica, política, programática. Ideas que debemos traer al presente directamente. Revisando algunas ideas, precisamente, decía Marx y Engels hace 173 años, las tesis teóricas de los comunistas no se basan en modo alguno en ideas y principios inventados o descubiertos por tal o cual reformador del mundo. No son sino la expresión conjunto de las condiciones reales de una lucha de clases existente, de un movimiento histórico que se está desarrollando ante nuestros ojos. Es así y ha sido así. En particular en Venezuela, la revolución bolivariana ha sido la conjunción de las luchas de clases históricas acumuladas durante 500 años de lucha contra el colonialismo, contra el neocolonialismo, contra el imperialismo y contra todas las formas que la burguesía y la oligarquía ha adquirido para ejercer su dominación, su poder en nuestra patria y en toda la región latinoamericana y caribeña. Nuestra revolución bolivariana ha asumido desde el principio, con el comandante Hugo Chávez, las ideas fundamentales de Marx y Engels. La idea del materialismo histórico, la idea de la dialéctica materialista y la idea de la búsqueda de la utopía posible, de la utopía concreta hacia el futuro de una humanidad con un socialismo con particularidades de acuerdo a todas las regiones y países y culturas del mundo. Nosotros enarbolamos con mucha fuerza a 173 años de este documento fundamental de la historia de la humanidad, enarbolamos las ideas de la lucha revolucionaria, de la lucha de clases por una sociedad superior, una sociedad más humana, donde la clase obrera, lo digo como orgulloso miembro militante de la clase obrera venezolana, lo digo como obrero, lo digo como conductor de autobús, como luchador sindical, como luchador de la clase obrera venezolana. Lo digo, lo más importante es agrupar y unir las fuerzas. 173 años después, debemos decir, debe privar el espíritu unitario, abarcador, incluyente, amplio de todas las fuerzas progresistas, revolucionarias, que buscan el socialismo en la humanidad. Debe privar el encuentro y el reencuentro, sin sectarismo de ningún tipo, sin dogmatismo de ningún tipo, construyendo de acuerdo a la realidad concreta, la teoría concreta de la lucha de clases y la lucha por el socialismo en cada país y en cada región. Es fundamental. Recojo también del Manifiesto Comunista reflexiones importantes hacia la clase obrera como clase fundamental de los procesos de cambio hoy en el siglo XXI en todos los países del mundo, sin lugar a dudas. Decía Carlos Marx y Federico Engels hace 173 años. Aquí y allá la lucha estalla en sublevación. A veces los obreros triunfan, pero es un triunfo efímero. El verdadero resultado de sus luchas no es el éxito inmediato, sino la unión cada vez más extensa de los obreros. Esta unión es propiciada por el crecimiento de los medios de comunicación creados por la gran industria y que ponen en contacto a los obreros de diferentes localidades, rompían todo el aislamiento de siglos y siglos de las clases trabajadoras. Y continúa el manifiesto diciendo, y basta ese contacto para que muchas luchas locales, que en todas partes revisten el mismo carácter, se centralicen en una lucha nacional, en una lucha de clases. Pero toda lucha de clases es una lucha política. Y la unión que los habitantes de las ciudades de la Edad Media, con sus caminos vecinales, tardaron siglos en establecer, los proletarios modernos con los ferrocarriles la llevan a cabo en unos pocos años. Era otra realidad del siglo XIX, pero ya descubrían la esencia de la importancia de los medios de comunicación para unir a la clase obrera en sus luchas por la justicia, por la humanidad, por el socialismo. Así que hoy nosotros tenemos esta vía de comunicación. Reforcemos las maneras de comunicación entre nuestros movimientos políticos, entre los intelectuales, entre los partidos, entre las editoriales, entre las fuerzas de la renovación mundial, para que podamos unir las luchas del presente y articular las victorias del futuro. Desde la Venezuela bolivariana, la Venezuela rumbo al socialismo, desde la Venezuela chavista, les digo, amigos y amigas del mundo, aquí estamos en una trinchera de la lucha de ideas, de la lucha de la humanidad, victoriosos, de pie y tendiendo la mano a la unión de todos los movimientos del mundo. Otro mundo es posible. 173 años y la lucha continúa y avanza. Muchas gracias.
Arise, ye prisoners of starvation. Arise, ye toilers of the earth. For reason thunders new creation. 'Tis a better world in birth. Nevermore tradition's change shall bind us. Arise, ye toilers, no more enthralled. The earth shall rise on new foundations. We have been not, we shall be all. So comrades, come rally, and the last fight let us face. The Internationale unites the human race. So comrades, come rally, and the last fight let us face. The Internationale unites the human race. Arise, ye toilers of all nations, condemned to misery and woe. To hell with humbleness and patience, give deadly battle to the foe. Wipe out the rule of wealthy classes. Arise and smash your throat on chains. Let power be wielded by the masses. Let those who labor hold the reins. So comrades, come rally, and the last fight let us face. The Internationale unites the human race. So comrades, come rally, and the last fight let us face. The Internationale unites the human race. Forward, socialism, forward.
Manifesto of the Communist Party. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this specter. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals, and German police spies. Where is the party in opposition that has not been decried as communistic by its opponents in power? Where is the opposition that has not hurled back the branding reproach of communism against the more advanced opposition parties, as well as against its reactionary adversaries? Two things result from this fact. One, communism is already acknowledged by all European powers to be itself a power. Two, it is high time that communists should openly, in the face of the whole world, publish their views, their aims, their tendencies, and meet this nursery tale of the specter of communism with the manifesto of the party itself. To this end, communists of various nationalities have assembled in London and sketched the following manifesto to be published in the English, French, German, Italian, Flemish, and Danish languages. Chapter 1, Bourgeois and Proletarians. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. In the earlier epochs of history, we find almost everywhere a complicated arrangement of society into various orders, a manifold gradation of social rank. In ancient Rome, we have patricians, knights, plebeians, slaves. In the Middle Ages, feudal lords, vassals, guildmasters, journeymen, apprentices, serfs. In almost all of these classes, again, subordinate gradations. The modern bourgeois society that has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society has not done away with class antagonism. It has but established new classes, new conditions of oppression, new forms of struggle in place of the old ones. Our epoch, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, possesses, however, this distinct feature. It has simplified class antagonisms. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other, bourgeoisie and proletariat. From the serfs of the Middle Ages sprang the chartered burghers of the earliest towns. From these burgesses, the first elements of the bourgeoisie were developed.
The discovery of America, the rounding of the Cape, opened up fresh ground for the rising bourgeoisie. The East Indian and Chinese markets, the colonization of America, trade with the colonies, the increase in the means of exchange and in the commodities generally, gave to commerce, to navigation, to industry, an impulse never before known, and thereby to the revolutionary element in the tottering feudal society, a rapid development. The feudal system of industry, in which industrial production was monopolized by closed guilds, now no longer sufficed for the growing wants of the new markets. The manufacturing system took its place. The guild masters were pushed on one side by the manufacturing middle class. Division of labor between the different corporate guilds vanished in the face of division of labor in each single workshop. Meantime, the markets kept ever growing, the demand ever rising. Even manufacture no longer sufficed. Thereupon, steam and machinery revolutionized industrial production. The place of manufacture was taken by the giant, modern industry. The place of the industrial middle class by industrial millionaires, the leaders of the whole industrial armies, the modern bourgeois. Modern industry has established the world market, for which the discovery of America paved the way. This market has given an immense development to commerce, to navigation, to communication by land. This development has, in turn, reacted on the extension of industry, and in proportion as industry, commerce, navigation, railways extended, in the same proportion the bourgeoisie developed, increased its capital, and pushed into the background every class handed down from the Middle Ages. We see, therefore, how the modern bourgeoisie is itself the product of a long course of development, of a series of revolutions in the modes of production and of exchange. Each step in the development of the bourgeoisie was accompanied by a corresponding political advance of that class, an oppressed class under the sway of the feudal nobility, an armed and self-governing association in the medieval commune. Here, independent urban republic, as in Italy and Germany, there, taxable third estate of the monarchy, as in France. Afterwards, in the period of manufacturing proper, serving either the semi-feudal or the absolute monarchy as the counterpoise against the nobility, and in fact, cornerstone of the great monarchies in general. The bourgeoisie has at last, since the establishment of modern industry and of the world market, conquered for itself, in the modern representative state, exclusive political sway. The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie.
Bourgeoisie historically has played a most revolutionary part. The bourgeoisie, wherever it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism in the icy waters of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in place of the numberless indefeasible chartered freedoms, has set up that single unconscionable freedom: free trade. In one word for exploitation, veiled by religious and political illusions, it has substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. The bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored and looked up to with reverent awe. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science into paid wage laborers. The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil and has reduced the family relation to a mere money relation. The bourgeoisie has disclosed how it came to pass that the brutal display of vigor in the Middle Ages, which reactionaries so admire, found its way fitting complement in the most slothful indolence. It has been the first to show what man's activity can bring about. It has accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. It has conducted expeditions that have put in the shade all former exoduses of nations and crusades. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. Conservation of the old modes of production in unaltered form was, on the contrary, the first condition of existence for all earlier industrial classes. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. All fixed, fast frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air, all that is wholly profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. The need to constantly expand the market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the entire surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere.
The bourgeoisie has, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. To the great chagrin of reactionists, it is drawn from under the feet of industry, the national ground on which it stood. All old established national industries have been destroyed or are daily being destroyed. They are dislodged by new industries, whose introduction becomes a life and death question for all civilized nations, by industries that no longer work up indigenous raw material, but raw material drawn from the remotest zones. Industries whose products are consumed not only at home, but in every quarter of the globe. In place of the old wants, satisfied by the production of the country, we find new wants, requiring for their satisfaction the products of distant lands and climes. In place of the old local and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, universal interdependence of nations. And as in material, so also in intellectual production. The intellectual creations of individual nations become common property. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible, and from the numerous national and local literatures there arises a world literature. The bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communication, draws all, even the most barbarian nations, into civilization. The cheap prices of commodities, or the heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls, with which it forces the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. It compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, i.e., to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates a world after its own image. The bourgeoisie has subjected the country to the rule of the towns. It has created enormous cities, has greatly increased the urban population as compared with the rural, and has thus rescued a considerable part of the population from the idiocy of rural life. Just as it has made the country dependent on the towns, so it has made barbarian and semi-barbarian countries dependent on the civilized ones, nations of peasants on nations of bourgeois, the East on the West. The bourgeoisie keeps more and more doing away with the scattered state of the population, of the means of production, and of property. It has agglomerated population, centralized the means of production, and has concentrated property in a few hands. The necessary consequence of this was political centralization. Independent or but loosely connected provinces with separate interests, laws, governments, and systems of taxation became lumped together into one nation with one government, one code of laws, one national class interest, one frontier, and one customs tariff.
En el siglo corto que lleva de existencia como clase soberana, la burguesía ha creado energías productivas mucho más grandiosas y colosales que todas las pasadas generaciones juntas. Basta pensar en el sometimiento de las fuerzas naturales por la mano del hombre, en la maquinaria, en la aplicación de la química a la agricultura y a la industria, en la navegación de vapor, en los ferrocarriles, en el telégrafo eléctrico, en la roturación de continentes enteros, en los ríos abiertos para la navegación, en los nuevos pueblos que brotaron de la tierra como por ensalmo. ¿Quién en los pasados siglos pudo sospechar siquiera que en el regazo de la sociedad fecundada por el trabajo del hombre yaciesen soterradas tantas y tales energías y elementos de producción? Hemos visto que los medios de producción y de transporte sobre los cuales se desarrolló la burguesía brotaron en el seno de la sociedad feudal. Cuando estos medios de transporte y de producción alcanzaron una determinada fase en su desarrollo, resultó que las condiciones en que la sociedad feudal producía y comerciaba, la organización feudal de la agricultura y la manufactura, en una palabra, el régimen feudal de la propiedad, no correspondían ya al estado progresivo de las fuerzas productivas. Obstruían la producción en vez de fomentarla. Se habían convertido en otras tantas trabas para su desenvolvimiento. Era menester hacerlas saltar y saltaron. Vino a ocupar su puesto, libre concurrencia, con la constitución política y social a ella adecuada, en la que se revelaba ya la hegemonía política, económica de la clase burguesa. Pues bien, ante nuestros ojos se desarrolla hoy un espectáculo semejante. Las condiciones de producción y de cambio de la burguesía, el régimen burgués de la propiedad, la moderna sociedad burguesa, que ha sabido hacer brotar como por encanto tan fabulosos medios de producción y de transporte, recuerda al brujo imponente para dominar los espíritus subterráneos que conjuró. Desde hace varias décadas, la historia de la industria y del comercio no es más que la historia de las modernas fuerzas productivas que se rebelan contra el régimen vigente de producción, contra el régimen de la propiedad, donde residen las condiciones de vida y de predominio político de la burguesía. Basta mencionar las crisis comerciales, cuya periódica reiteración supone un peligro cada vez mayor para la existencia de la sociedad burguesa. Las crisis comerciales, además de destruir una gran parte de los productos elaborados, aniquilan una parte considerable de las fuerzas productivas existentes. En esas crisis se desata una epidemia social que a cualquiera de las épocas anteriores hubieran parecido absurdas e inconcebibles. La epidemia de la superproducción. La sociedad se va retrotraída repentinamente a un estado de barbarie momentánea. Se diría que una plaga de hambre o una gran guerra aniquiladora que le han dejado esquimando. Sin recursos para subsistir, la industria y el comercio están a punto de perecer. ¿Y todo por qué? Porque la sociedad posee demasiada civilización, demasiados recursos, demasiada industria, demasiado comercio. Las fuerzas productivas de que dispone no sirven ya para fomentar el régimen burgués de la propiedad. Son ya demasiado poderosas para servir a este régimen que embaraza su desarrollo. Y tan pronto como logran vencer un obstáculo, siembran el desorden en la sociedad burguesa, amenazan dar al traste con el régimen burgués de la propiedad. Las condiciones sociales burguesas resultan ya demasiado angostas para abarcar la riqueza por ellas engendradas.
And how does the bourgeoisie get over these crises? On the one hand, by enforcing destruction of a mass of productive forces. On the other, by the conquest of new markets, and by the more thorough exploitation of the old ones. That is to say, by paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises, and by diminishing the means whereby crises are prevented. The weapons with which the bourgeoisie failed feudalism to the ground are now turned against the bourgeoisie itself. But not only has the bourgeoisie forged the weapons that bring death to itself, it has also called into existence the men who are to wield those weapons, the modern working class, the proletarians. In proportion as the bourgeoisie, i.e. capital, is developed, in the same proportion is the proletariat, the modern working class, developed. A class of laborers who live only so long as they can find work, and who find work only so long as their labor increases capital. These laborers, who must sell themselves piecemeal, are a commodity, like every other article of commerce, and are consequently exposed to all the vicissitudes of competition, to all the fluctuations of the market. Owing to the extensive use of machinery and to the division of labor, the work of the proletarians has lost all individual character and consequently all charm for the workman. He becomes an appendage of the machine. And it is only the most simple, most monotonous, and most easily acquired knack that is required of him. Hence, the cost of production of a workman is restricted almost entirely to the means of subsistence that he requires for maintenance and for the propagation of his race. But the price of a commodity, and therefore also of labor, is equal to its cost of production. In proportion, therefore, as the repulsiveness of the work increases, the wage decreases. Nay more, in proportion as the use of machinery and division of labor increases, in the same proportion the burden of toil also increases, whether by prolongation of the working hours, by the increase of the work exacted in a given time, or by increased speed of machinery, etc. Modern industry has converted the little workshop of the patriarchal master into the great factory of the industrial capitalist. Masses of workers crowded into a factory are organized like soldiers. As privates of the industrial army, they are placed under the command of a perfect hierarchy of officers and sergeants. Not only are they slaves of the bourgeois class and of the bourgeois state, they are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine, by the overlooker, and above all, by the individual bourgeois manufacturer himself. The more openly this despotism proclaims gain to be its end and aim, the more petty, the more hateful, and the more embittering it is. The less the skill and exertion of force implied in manual labor, in other words, the more modern industry becomes developed, the more is the labor of men superseded by that of women. Differences of age and sex have no longer any distinctive social validity for the working class. All are instruments of labor, more or less expensive to use according to their age and their sex. No sooner is the exploitation of the laborer by the manufacturer so far at an end that he receives his wages in cash. Then he is set upon by the other portions of the bourgeoisie, the landlord, the shopkeeper, the pawnbroker, etc.
Ang nakabababang saray ng panggitnang uri, ang maliliit na magtitingi may tindahan at retiradong mga artisano sa kalahatan, ang mga tagayaring kamay at magsasaka. Lahat ng ito'y lumulubog sa katayuang proletaryado. Sa bahagi, dahil ang kanilang maliit na kapital ay hindi sapat para sa laki ng antas ng paggana ng modernong industriya at napapalis sa kompetisyon sa malalaking kapitalista. At sa bahagi, dahil nawawalan ng halaga ang espesyalisadong kasanayan ng bagong mga pamamaraan sa produksyon. Sa gayon, nirerekluta ang proletaryado mula sa lahat ng uri ng populasyon. Nagdaraan ang proletaryado sa iba't ibang yugto ng pag-unlad. Sa pagsilang nito ay nagsisimula ang tunggalian nito sa burgesya. Sa simula, ang pakikibaka ay isinasagawa ng individual na mga manggagawa. Pagkatapos ng mga manggagawa sa isang pabrika, pagkatapos ng mga operatiba ng isang sangay ng industriya sa isang lokalidad laban sa individual na burges na tuwirang nagsasamantala sa kanila. Itinutuon nila ang kanilang atake hindi laban sa burges na kalagayan sa produksyon, kundi laban sa mga instrumento ng produksyon mismo. Winawasak nila ang inangkat na mga kasangkapan na nakikipagkompetensya sa kanilang paggawa. Winawasak nila ang makinarya. Sinusulong nila ang mga pabrika. Tinatangka nilang puwersahang ipanumbalik ang naglahong katayuan ng manggagawa ng kapanahunang medyebal. Sa yugtong ito, ang mga manggagawa ay bumubuo pa ng hiwa-hiwalay na masang kalat-kalat sa buong bayan at hati-hati ng kanilang mutual na kompetisyon. Kung may lugar mang nagkakaisa sila para magbuo ng mas masinsing organisasyon, hindi pa ito resulta ng sarili nilang aktibong pagkakaisa, kundi ng pagkakaisa ng burgesya na isang uri na puwersadong pakilusin ang buong proletaryado para matamo ang sariling mga layunin sa politika at dagdag pa, may kakayahang gawin iyon sa isang panahon. Sa makatuwid, sa yugtong ito, hindi nilalabanan ng mga proletaryo ang kanilang mga kaaway, kundi ang mga kaaway ng kanilang mga kaaway. Ang mga labi ng absolutong monarkiya, ang mga may lupa, ang di-industrial na burges, ang petty burges. Sa gayon, ang buong historikong kilusan ay nagkokonsentra sa mga kamay ng burgesya. Bawat tagumpay na natatamo sa gayon ay isang tagumpay para sa burgesya. Pero sa pag-unlad ng industriya, hindi lamang lumalaki ang bilang ng proletaryado, nakokonsentra ito sa mas malalaking bilang lumalakas ito at higit nitong nadarama ang lakas na iyon. Ang iba't ibang interes at kondisyon ng buhay sa hanay ng proletaryado ay higit na napapantay-pantay sa antas na pinapawi ng makinarya ang lahat ng pag-iiba ng paggawa. At sa halos lahat ng lugar, pinaliliit ang sahod sa iisang mababang antas. Dahil sa papalaking kompetisyon sa hanay ng burges at ang ibinubunga nitong mga krisis sa komersyo, lalong nagiging pabago-bago ang sahod ng mga manggagawa. Lalong nawawalan ng katiyakan ang kanilang kabuhayan dahil sa higit na pag-unlad ng makinarya na tuloy-tuloy na bumibilis sa pag-unlad. Ang mga salpukan sa pagitan ng individual na mga manggagawa at individual na burges ay higit na nagkakaroon ng katangian ng salpukan sa pagitan ng dalawang uri. Dahil sa gayon, nagsisimulang magbuo ng mga kombinasyon o union ang mga manggagawa laban sa burges. Nagsasama-sama sila para panatilihin ang antas ng sahod. Nagtatatag sila ng permanenteng mga samahan upang antemano'y paghandaan ang panapanahong paghihimagsik na ito. Doon at dito, humahantong ang labanan sa mga riot. Paminsan-minsan, matagumpay ang mga manggagawa. Pero panandalian lamang. Ang tunay na bunga ng kanilang pakikipagsagupa ay wala sa kagyat na resulta, kundi sa laging lumalaking unyon ng mga manggagawa. Natutulungan ang unyong ito ng maunlad na pamamaraan ng komunikasyon na nililikha ng modernong industriya at nakapag-uugnay sa mga manggagawa ng iba't ibang lokalidad sa isa't isa. Ito mismong ugnayang ito ang kinakailangan para sentralisahin ang maraming lokal na pakikibaka na iisa ang katangian ng lahat bilang pambansang tunggalian sa pagitan ng mga uri. Pero bawat tunggalian sa uri ay isang pampulitikang tunggalian. At ang pagkakaisang iyon na nangangailangan ng ilang siglo mula sa mga burger ng kapanahunang medieval para matamo, dala ng kanilang miserableng mga highway ay makakamit ng modernong manggagawa sa loob ng ilang taon salamat sa perokaril. Ang organisasyong ito ng mga manggagawa bilang isang uri at bunga nito bilang isang pampulitikang partido ay patuloy na nagugulong muli sa kompetisyon sa hanay ng mga manggagawa mismo. Pero lagi itong nagbabangong muli na mas malakas, mas matatag, at mas makapangyarihan. Ipinupwersa nito ang lehislatibong pagkilala sa partikular na mga interes ng mga manggagawa sa pamamagitan ng pagsasamantala sa mga dibisyon sa hanay ng burgesya mismo. Sa gayon, napagtibay ang panukalang batas sa 10 oras na paggawa sa England.
Altogether, collisions between the classes of the old society further, in many ways, the course of development of the proletariat. The bourgeoisie finds itself involved in a constant battle, at first with the aristocracy, later on with those portions of the bourgeoisie itself, whose interests have become antagonistic to the progress of industry, at all time with the bourgeoisie of foreign countries. In all these battles, it sees itself compelled to appeal to the proletariat, to ask for help, and thus to drag it into the political arena. The bourgeoisie itself, therefore, supplies the proletariat with its own elements of political and general education. In other words, it furnishes the proletariat with weapons for fighting the bourgeoisie.
فحتى الآن كانت الحركات كلها إما حركات أقليات وإما لمصلحة الأقليات، والحركة البروليتارية هي الحركة القائمة بذاتها للأغلبية الساحقة في سبيل الأغلبية الساحقة. والبروليتاريا الفئة الدنيا في المجتمع الراهن لا يمكنها أن تنهض وتنتصب بدون أن تنسف البنية الفوقية كلها للفئات التي تؤلف المجتمع الرسمي. ومع أن نضال البروليتاري ضد البرجوازية ليس قوميا في محتواه، فإنه يتخذ في البداية الشكل القومي، ولا حاجة إلى القول إن على البروليتاريا في كل بلد أن تتخلص من برجوازيتها الخاصة. وبإجمالنا أطوار نمو البروليتاريا في خطوتها الكبرى تتبعنا أيضا الحروب الأهلية الكامنة تقريبا داخل المجتمع القائم، حتى الحين الذي تنفجر فيه هذه الحروب ثورة علنية ترسي البروليتاريا سيطرتها بإطاحة البرجوازية بالعنف. وقد رأينا أن كل مجتمع حتى الآن قام على التناحر بين الطبقات العسفية والطبقات المضطهدة، وللتمكن من اضطهاد طبقة ينبغي أن تؤمن لها شروط معيشية تمكنها على الأقل من مواصلة وجودها العبودي. فالقن في عهد القنانة توصل إلى أن يغدو عضوا في كمونة، وكذلك ارتفع البرجوازي الصغير إلى برجوازي تحت نير الحكم الإقطاعي الاستبدادي. بخلاف ذلك فإن العامل العصري بدلا من أن يرتفع مع تقدم الصناعة لا ينحت عميقا دون أوضاع طبقته نفسها، فالعامل يغدو مدقعا والعوز يزداد بسرعة تفوق سرعة نمو السكان والثروة. وبناء عليه يتضح أن البرجوازية عاجزة عن أن تبقى زمنا أطول الطبقة السائدة، وأن تفرض على المجتمع شروط وجود طبقتها كقانون أعلى، فهي عاجزة عن أن تسيطر لأنها عاجزة عن تأمين عيش عبدها حتى في إطار عبوديتهم، لأنها مرغمة على تركه ينحط إلى وضع يلزمها بأن تعيله بدلا من أن يعيلها. فالمجتمع لم يعد يستطيع أن يحيا تحت سيطرتها، أو بعبارة أخرى لم يعد وجود البرجوازية يلائم المجتمع. فالشرط الأساسي لوجود الطبقة البرجوازية ولسيطرتها هو تكديس الثروة في أيدي خواص، تكوين الرأسمال وإنمائه. وشرط وجود الرأسمال هو العمل المأجور، والعمل المأجور يقوم حصرا على المزاحمة بين العمال. وتقدم الصناعة الذي تشكل البرجوازية دعامته بلا إرادة منها وبلا مقاومة يحل وحدة العمال الثورية عبر الترابط محل انفرادهم الناتج عن تزاحمهم. وهكذا فإن تطور الصناعة الكبرى يزلزل تحت أقدام البرجوازية الأساس الذي تنتج عليه وتتملك المنتجات. إن البرجوازية تنتج قبل كل شيء حفاري قبرها، فانهيارها وانتصار البروليتاريا أمران حتميان.
Chapter 2: Proletarians and Communists. In what relation do the communists stand to the proletarians as a whole? The communists do not form a separate party opposed to the other working class parties. They have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. They do not set up any sectarian principles of their own by which to shape and mold the proletarian movement. The communists are distinguished from the other working class parties by this only. 1. In the national struggle of the proletarians of the different countries, they point out and bring to the front the common interests of the entire proletariat, independently of all nationality. 2. In the various stages of development which the struggle of the working class against the bourgeoisie has to pass through, they always and everywhere represent the interests of the movement as a whole. The communists, therefore, are on the one hand practically the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country, that section which pushes forward all others. On the other hand, theoretically, they have over the great mass of the proletariat the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement. The immediate aim of the communists is the same as that of all other proletarian parties. Formation of the proletariat into a class, overthrow of the bourgeois supremacy, conquest of political power by the proletariat. The theoretical conclusions of the communists are no way based on ideas or principles that have been invented or discovered by this or that would-be universal reformer. They merely express in general terms actual relations springing from an existing class struggle, from a historical movement going on under our very eyes. The abolition of existing property relations is not at all a distinctive feature of communism. All property relations in the past have continually been subjected to historical change, consequent upon the change in historical conditions. The French Revolution, for example, abolished feudal property in favor of bourgeois property. The distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property. But modern bourgeois private property is the final and most complete expression of the system of producing and appropriating products that is based on class antagonisms, on the exploitation of the many by the few. In this sense, the theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence: abolition of private property. We communists have been reproached with the desire of abolishing the right of personally acquiring property as the fruit of a man's own labor, which property is alleged to be the groundwork of all personal freedom, activity, and independence. Hard-won, self-acquired, self-earned property. Do you mean the property of petty artisan and of the small peasant, a form of property that preceded the bourgeois form? There is no need to abolish that. The development of industry has to a great extent already destroyed it and is still destroying it daily. Or do you mean the modern bourgeois private property? But does wage labor create any property for the laborer? Not a bit. It creates capital, i.e., that kind of property which exploits wage labor and which cannot increase except on condition of begetting a new supply of wage labor for fresh exploitation. Property in its present form is based on the antagonism of capital and wage labor. Let us examine both sides of this antagonism. To be a capitalist, to have not only a purely personal, but a social status in production. Capital is a collective product owned only by the united action of many members. Nay, in the last resort, only by the united action of all members of society can it be set in motion. Capital is therefore not only personal, it is a social power. When therefore capital is converted into common property, into the property of all members of society, personal property is not thereby transformed into social property. It is only the social character of the property that is changed. It loses its class character.
Let us now take wage labor. The average price of wage labor is the minimum wage, i.e., that quantum of the means of subsistence which is absolutely requisite to keep the laborer in bare existence as a laborer. What, therefore, the wage laborer appropriates by means of his labor merely suffices to prolong and reproduce a bare existence. We by no means intend to abolish this personal appropriation of the products of labor, an appropriation that is made for the maintenance and reproduction of human life, and that leaves no surplus wherewith to command the labor of others. All that we want to do away with is the miserable character of this appropriation, under which the laborer lives merely to increase capital, and is allowed to live only insofar as the interest of the ruling class requires it. In bourgeois society, living labor is but a means to increase accumulated labor. In communist society, accumulated labor is but a means to widen, to enrich, to promote the existence of the laborer. In bourgeois society, therefore, the past dominates the present. In communist society, the present dominates the past. In bourgeois society, capital is independent and has individuality, while the living person is dependent and has no individuality. And the abolition of this state of things is called by the bourgeois abolition of individuality and freedom. And rightly so, The abolition of bourgeois individuality, bourgeois independence, and bourgeois freedom is undoubtedly aimed at. By freedom is meant, under the present bourgeois conditions of production, free trade, free selling and buying. But if selling and buying disappears, free selling and buying disappears also. This talk about free selling and buying and all the other brave words of our bourgeois about freedom in general have a meaning, if any, only in contrast with the restricted selling and buying, with the fettered traders of the Middle Ages, but have no meaning when opposed to the communistic abolition of buying and selling, of the bourgeois conditions of production, and of the bourgeoisie itself.
You are horrified at our intending to do away with private property. But in your existing society, private property is already done away with for 9/10 of the population. Its existence for the few is solely due to its non-existence in the hands of those 9/10. You reproach us, therefore, with intending to do away with a form of property, the necessary condition for whose existence is the non-existence of any property for the immense majority of society. In one word, you reproach us with intending to do away with your property. Precisely so. That is just what we intend. From the moment when labor can no longer be converted into capital, money, or rent into a social power capable of being monopolized, that is, from the moment when individual property can no longer be transformed into bourgeois property, into capital, from that moment you say individuality vanishes. You must therefore confess that by individual, you mean no other person than the bourgeois, than the middle-class owner of property. This person must indeed be swept out of the way and made impossible. Communism deprives no man of the power to appropriate the products of society. All that it does is to deprive him of the power to subjugate the labor of others by means of such appropriations. It has been objected that upon the abolition of private property, all work will cease and universal laziness will overtake us. According to this, bourgeois society ought long ago to have gone to the dogs through sheer idleness. For those of its members who work acquire nothing, and for those who acquire anything do not work. The whole of this objection is but another expression of the tautology that there can no longer be any wage labor when there is no longer any capital. All objections urged against the communistic mode of producing and appropriating material products have in the same way been urged against the communistic mode of producing and appropriating intellectual products. Just as to the bourgeois, the disappearance of class property is the disappearance of production itself, so the disappearance of class culture is to him identical with the disappearance of all culture. That culture, the loss of which he laments, is for the enormous majority a mere training to act as a machine. But don't wrangle with us so long as you apply to our intended abolition of private property the standard of your bourgeois notions of freedom, culture, law, etc. Your very ideas are but the outgrowth of the conditions of your bourgeois production and bourgeois property, just as your jurisprudence is but the will of your class made into a law for all, a will whose essential character and direction are determined by the economical conditions of existence of your class. The selfish misconception that induces you to transform into eternal laws of nature and of reason the social forms springing from your present mode of production and form of property, historical relations that arise and disappear in the progress of production, this misconception you share with every ruling class that has preceded you. What you see clearly in the case of ancient property, what you admit in the case of feudal property, you are, of course, forbidden to admit in the case of your own bourgeois form of property.
가족의 폐질하니 공산주의 자들의 이 비열한 위대에 대해서는 가장 극단적인 급진주의자들까지도 격분하고 있다. 현대의 부르주아적 가족은 무엇에 기초를 두고 있는가? 그것은 자본, 즉사적인 영리에 기초를 두고 있다. 완전한 형태의 가족은 오직 부르주아를 위해서만 존재한다. 그리고 그것은 프롤레타리아를 부득이한 독신 생활과 공장 제도로 보완된다. 부르주아적 가족은 이러한 보완물이 소멸하면서 자연히 소멸할 것이며 또 그도 가지는 자본이 소멸하면서 둘 다 사라질 것이다. Do you charge us with wanting to stop the exploitation of children by their parents? To this crime we plead guilty. But you say, we destroy the most hallowed of relations when we replace home education by social. And your education? Is not that also social, and determined by the social conditions under which you educate? By the intervention, direct or indirect, of society by means of schools. The communists have not invented the intervention of society and education. They do but seek to alter the character of that intervention and to rescue education from the influence of the ruling class. The bourgeois claptrap about the family and education, about the hallowed correlation of parents and child, becomes all the more disgusting, the more by the action of modern industry. All the family ties among the proletarians are torn asunder, and their children transformed into simple articles of commerce and instruments of labor.
But you communists would introduce community of women, screams the bourgeoisie in chorus. The bourgeoisie sees his wife as a mere instrument of production. He hears that the instruments of production are to be exploited in common, and naturally can come to no other conclusion than the lot of being common to all will likewise fall to the women. He has not even a suspicion that the real point aimed at is to do away with the status of women as mere instruments of production. For the rest, nothing is more ridiculous than the virtuous indignation of our bourgeoisie at the community of women, which they pretend is to be openly and officially established by the communists. The communists have no need to introduce community of women. It has existed almost from time immemorial. Our bourgeoisie, not content with having wives and daughters of their proletarians at their disposal, not to speak of common prostitutes, take the greatest pleasure in seducing each other's wives. Bourgeois marriage is, in reality, a system of wives in common. And thus, at the most, what the communists might possibly be reproached with is that they desire to introduce, in substitution for hypocritically concealed, an openly legalized community of women. For the rest, it is self-evident that the abolition of the present system of production must bring with it the abolition of the community of women springing from that system, i.e., of prostitution, both public and private. The communists are further reproached with desiring to abolish countries and nationality. The working men have no country. We cannot take from them what they have not got. Since the proletariat must first of all acquire political supremacy, must rise to be the leading class of the nation, we must constitute itself the nation. It is so far itself national, though not in the bourgeois sense of the word. National differences and antagonism between peoples are daily more and more vanishing, owing to the development of the bourgeoisie, to freedom of commerce, to the world market, to uniformity in the mode of production and in the conditions of life corresponding thereto. The supremacy of the proletariat will cause them to vanish still faster. United action of the leading civilized countries at least is one of the first conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat. In proportion as the exploitation of one individual by another will be also put to an end, the exploitation of one nation by another will also be put an end to. In proportion as the antagonism between classes within the nation vanishes, the hostility of one nation to another will come to an end.
The charges against communism made from a religious, a philosophical, and generally from an ideological standpoint are not deserving of serious examination. Does it require deep intuition to comprehend that man's ideas, views, and conception, in one word, man's consciousness, changes with every change in the conditions of his material existence, in his social relations, and in his social life? What else does the history of ideas prove, then that intellectual production changes its character in proportion as material production is changed. The ruling ideas of each age have ever been the ideas of its ruling class. When people speak of the ideas that revolutionize society, they do but express that fact that within the old society, the elements of a new one have been created, and that the dissolution of the old ideas keeps even pace with the dissolution of the old conditions of existence. When the ancient world was in its last throes, the ancient religions were overcome by Christianity. When Christian ideas succumbed in the 18th century to rationalist ideas, feudal society fought its death battle with the then revolutionary bourgeoisie. The ideas of religious liberty and freedom of conscience merely gave expression to the sway of free competition within the domain of knowledge. Quote, undoubtedly, unquote, it will be said, quote, religious, moral, philosophical, juridical ideas have been modified in the course of historical development, but religion, morality, philosophy, political science, and law constantly survive this change. Quote, there are, besides, eternal truths, such as freedom, justice, etc., that are common to all states of society. But communism abolishes eternal truths. It abolishes all religion and all morality instead of constituting them on a new basis. It therefore acts in contradiction to all past experiences. Close quote. What does this accusation reduce itself to? The history of all past society has consisted on the development of class antagonisms that assume different forms at different epochs. But whatever form they may have taken, one fact is common to all past ages, viz., the exploitation of one part of society by the other. No wonder, then, that the social consciousness of past ages, despite all the multiplicity and variety it displays, moves within certain common forms or general ideas, which cannot completely vanish except with the total disappearance of class antagonisms. The Communist Revolution is the most radical rupture with traditional property relations. No wonder that its development involves the most radical rupture with traditional ideas.
But let us have done with the bourgeois objections to communism. We have seen above that the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class to win the battle of democracy. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest, by degrees, all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e., of the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total of productive forces as rapidly as possible. Of course, in the beginning, this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads on the rights of property and on conditions of bourgeois production, by means of measures, therefore, which appear economically insufficient and untenable, but which, in the course of the movement, outstrip themselves, necessitate further inroads upon the old social order, and are unavoidable as a means of entirely revolutionizing the mode of production. These measures will, of course, be different in different countries. Nevertheless, in the most advanced countries, the following will be pretty generally applicable. Number 1, abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. Number 2, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. Number 3, abolition of all right of inheritance. Number 4, confiscation of the property of all emigrants and rebels. Number 5, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. 6, centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. 7, extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, the bringing into cultivation of wastelands, and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. Number 8, equal liability of all to labor, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. Number 9, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of this distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the population over the country. 10, free education for all children in public schools, abolition of children's factory labor in its present form, combination of education with industrial production. When in the course of development, class distinctions have disappeared and all production has been concentrated in the hands of a vast association of the whole nation, the public power will lose its political character. Political power, properly so called, is merely the organized power of one class for oppressing another. If the proletariat during its contrast with the bourgeoisie is compelled, by the force of circumstances, to organize itself as a class, if by means of a revolution it makes itself the ruling class, and as such sweeps away by force the old conditions of production, then it will, along with these conditions, have swept away the conditions for the existence of class antagonisms and of classes generally, and will thereby have abolished its own supremacy as a class. In place of the old bourgeois system, with its classes and class antagonisms, we shall have an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all.
Devido à sua posição histórica, as aristocracias da França e da Inglaterra viram-se chamadas a lançar acusações contra a sociedade burguesa. Na Revolução Francesa de julho de 1830 e no movimento reformador inglês, tinham sucumbido mais uma vez sob os golpes dessa odiada oportunista, a burguesia. Elas não podiam mais travar uma luta política séria entre elas. Só lhes restava a luta literária. Também no domínio literário, tornara-se impossível o velho discurso da restauração. Para criar simpatias, era necessário que a aristocracia fingisse descuidar-se de seus próprios interesses e dirigisse sua acusação contra a burguesia, parecendo defender apenas os interesses da classe operária explorada. Assim, entregou-se ao prazer de cantarolar sátiras sobre os novos senhores burgueses e de lhes segredar aos ouvidos profecias de futuras catástrofes. Assim nasceu o socialismo feudal, onde se mesclavam lamentos e acusações, ecos do passado e ameaças sobre o futuro. Se por vezes a sua crítica amarga, incisiva e espirituosa feriu a burguesia no coração, foi sempre absolutamente incapaz de compreender a marcha da história moderna e terminou sempre com um efeito cômico. Na tentativa de chamar a atenção, a aristocracia sacudiu a sacola do mendigo a fim de atrair o proletariado. Mas logo que isso ocorreu, o povo notou as suas costas ornadas com velhos brasões feudais e abandonou-o com grandes gargalhadas altas e irreverentes. Uma parte dos legitimistas franceses e a jovem Inglaterra deram ao mundo esse espetáculo divertido. Quando os campeões do feudalismo demonstram que o modo de exploração feudal era diferente do da burguesia, esquecem de uma coisa, que o feudalismo explorava em circunstâncias e condições completamente diferentes e já bem ultrapassadas. Quando ressaltam que sob o regime feudal o proletariado moderno nem existia, esquecem de uma coisa, que a burguesia moderna é precisamente um fruto necessário de seu regime social. Aliás, ocultam tão pouco o caráter reacionário de sua crítica que sua principal acusação contra a burguesia consiste justamente em dizer que esta garante sob seu regime o desenvolvimento de uma classe que fará ir pelos ares toda a antiga ordem social. O que reprovam a burguesia é mais o ter produzido um proletariado revolucionário do que haver criado o proletariado em geral. Por isso, na luta política, participam ativamente de todas as medidas de repressão contra a classe operária. E na vida diária, a despeito de seu pomposo discurso, conformam-se perfeitamente em colher os frutos do ouro da árvore da indústria e trocar honra, amor e fidelidade pelo comércio de lã, açúcar de beterraba e aguardente. Do mesmo modo que o padre e o senhor feudal marcharam sempre de mãos dadas, o socialismo clerical marcha lado a lado com o socialismo feudal. Nada é mais fácil que recobrir o ascetismo cristão com um verniz socialista. Não se ergueu também o cristianismo contra a propriedade privada, o matrimônio e o Estado? E em seu lugar, não pregou a caridade e a pobreza, o celibato e a mortificação da carne, a vida monástica e a igreja? O socialismo cristão não passa de água benta com que o padre consagra o ressentimento da aristocracia.
The feudal aristocracy was not the only class that was ruined by the bourgeoisie, not the only class whose conditions of existence pined and perished in the atmosphere of modern bourgeois society. The medieval burgesses and the small peasant proprietors were the precursors of the modern bourgeoisie. In those countries which are but little developed industrially and commercially, these two classes still vegetate side by side with the rising bourgeoisie. In countries where modern civilization has become fully developed, a new class of petty bourgeois has been formed, fluctuating between proletariat and bourgeoisie, and ever renewing itself as a supplementary part of bourgeois society. The individual members of this class, however, are being constantly hurled down into the proletariat by the action of competition, and as modern industry develops, they even see the moment approaching when they will completely disappear as an independent section of modern society, to be replaced in manufactures, agriculture, and commerce by overlookers, bailiffs, and shopmen. In countries like France, where the peasants constitute far more than half the population, it was natural that writers who sided with the proletariat against the bourgeoisie should use, in their criticisms of the bourgeois regime, the standard of the peasant and petty bourgeois, and from the standpoint of these intermediate classes, should take up the cudgels for the working class. Thus arose petty bourgeois socialism. Sismondi was the head of this school, not only in France, but also in England. This school of socialism dissected with great acuteness the contradictions in the conditions of modern production. It laid bare the hypocritical apologies of economists. It proved incontrovertibly the disastrous effects of machinery and division of labor, the concentration of capital and land in a few hands, overproduction and crises. It pointed out the inevitable ruin of the petty bourgeois and peasant, the misery of the proletariat, the anarchy in production, the crying inequalities in the distribution of wealth, the industrial war of extermination between nations, the dissolution of old moral bonds, of the old family relations, the old nationalities. In its positive aims, however, this form of socialism aspires either to restoring the old means of production and of exchange, and with them the old property relations and the old society, or to cramping the modern means of production and of exchange within the framework of the old property relations that have been and were bound to be exploded by those means. In either case, it is both reactionary and utopian. Its last words are corporate guilds for manufacture, patriarchal relations in agriculture. Ultimately, when stubborn historical facts had dispersed all intoxicating effects of self-deception, this form of socialism ended in a miserable fit of the blues.
The socialist and communist literature of France, a literature that originated under the pressure of a bourgeoisie in power, and that was the expressions of the struggle against this power, was introduced into Germany at a time when the bourgeoisie in that country had just begun to contest with feudal absolutism. German philosophers, would-be philosophers, and men of letters eagerly seized on this literature, only forgetting that when these writings immigrated from France into Germany, French social conditions had not immigrated along with them. In contact with German social conditions, this French literature lost all its immediate practical significance and assumed a purely literary aspect. Thus, to the German philosophers of the 18th century, the demands of the First French Revolution were nothing more than the demands of practical reason in general, and the utterance of the will of the revolutionary French bourgeoisie signified in their eyes the laws of pure will, of will as it was bound to be, of true human will generally. The work of the German literati consisted solely in bringing the new French ideas into harmony with their ancient philosophical conscience, or rather, in annexing the French ideas without deserting their own philosophic point of view. This annexation took place in the same way in which a foreign language is appropriated, namely, by translation. It's well known how the monks wrote silly lives of Catholic saints over the manuscripts on which the classical works of ancient heathendom had been written. The German literati reversed this process with their profane French literature. They wrote their philosophical nonsense beneath the French original. For instance, beneath the French criticism of the economic functions of money, they wrote alienation of humanity. And beneath the French criticism of the bourgeois state, they wrote dethronement of the category of the general, and so forth. The introduction of these philosophical phrases at the back of the French historical criticisms, they dubbed philosophy of action, true socialism, German science of socialism, philosophical foundations of socialism, and so on. The French socialist and communist literature was thus completely emasculated, and since it ceased in the hands of the German to express the struggle of one class with the other, he felt conscious of having overcome French one-sidedness and of representing not true requirements, but the requirements of truth, not the interests of the proletariat, but the interest of human nature, of man in general, who belongs to no class, has no reality, who exists only in the misty realms of philosophical fantasy. This German socialism, which took its schoolboy task so seriously and solemnly, and extolled its poor stock in trade in such a mountebank fashion, meanwhile gradually lost its pedantic innocence.
The fight of the Germans, and especially of the Prussian bourgeoisie, against feudal aristocracy and absolute monarchy, in other words, the liberal movement, became more earnest. By this, the long-wished opportunity was offered to true socialism, of confronting the political movement with socialist demands, of hurling the traditional anathemas against liberalism, against representative government, against bourgeois competition, bourgeois freedom of the press, bourgeois legislation, bourgeois liberty and equality, and of preaching to the masses that they had nothing to gain and everything to lose by this bourgeois movement. German socialism forgot, in the nick of time, that the French criticism, whose silly echo it was, presupposed the existence of modern bourgeois society, with its corresponding economic conditions of existence, and the political constitution adapted thereto, the very things those attainment was the object of the pending struggle in Germany. To the absolute governments, with their following of parsons, professors, country squires, and officials, it served as a welcome scarecrow against the threatening bourgeoisie. It was a sweet finish after the bitter pills of flogging and bullets with which these same governments just at the time dosed the German working class risings. While this true socialism served the government as a weapon for fighting the German bourgeoisie, it at the same time directly represented a reactionary interest, the interest of German Philistines. In Germany, the petty bourgeoisie class, a relic of the 16th century, and since then constantly cropping up against the various forms, is the real social basis of the existing state of things. To preserve this class is to preserve the existing state of things in Germany. The industrial and political supremacy of the bourgeoisie threatens it with certain destruction. On the one hand, from the concentration of capital, on the other, from the rise of the revolutionary proletariat. True socialism appeared to kill these two birds with one stone. It spread like an epidemic. The robe of speculative cobwebs, embroidered with flowers of rhetoric, steeped in the dew of sickly sentiment, this transcendental robe in which the German socialists wrapped their sorry eternal truce, all skin and bones, served to wonderfully increase the sale of their goods among such a public. And on its part, German socialism recognized more and more its own calling as a bombastic representative of the petty bourgeoisie Philistine. It proclaimed the German nation to be the model nation, and the German petty Philistine to be the typical man. To every villainous meanness of this model man, it gave a hidden, higher, socialistic interpretation, the exact contrary of its real character. It went to the extreme length of directly opposing the brutally destructive tendency of communism and of proclaiming its supreme and impartial contempt of all class struggles. With very few exceptions, all the so-called socialist and communist publications that now, from 1847, circulate in Germany belong to the domain of this foul and enervating literature.
Conservative or bourgeois socialism. A part of the bourgeoisie is desirous of redressing social grievances in order to secure the continued existence of bourgeois society. To this section belong economists, philanthropists, humanitarians, improvers of the condition of working class, organizers of charity, members of societies for the prevention of cruelty to animals, temperance fanatics, hole and corner reformers of every imaginable kind. This form of socialism has, moreover, been worked out into complete systems. We may cite Proudhon's Philosophie de la Misère as an example of this form. The socialistic bourgeois want all the advantages of modern social conditions without the struggles and dangers necessarily resulting therefrom. They desire the existing state of society minus its revolutionary and disintegrating elements. They wish for a bourgeoisie without a proletariat. The bourgeoisie naturally conceives the world in which it is supreme to be the best, and bourgeois socialism develops this comfortable conception into various more or less complete systems. In requiring the proletariat to carry out such a system, and thereby to march straightway into the social New Jerusalem, it but requires in reality that the proletariat should remain within the bounds of existing society, but should cast away all its hateful ideas concerning the bourgeoisie. A second and more practical, but less systematic form of this socialism sought to depreciate every revolutionary movement in the eyes of the working class by showing that no mere political reform, but only a change in the material conditions of existence in economical relations could be of any advantage to them. By changes in the material conditions of existence, this form of socialism, however, by no means understands abolition of the bourgeois relations of production, an abolition that can be effected only by a revolution, but administrative reforms based on the continued existence of these relations. Reforms, therefore, that in no respect affect the relations between capital and labor, but at best lessen the cost and simplify the administrative work of bourgeois government. Bourgeois socialism attains adequate expression when and only when it becomes a mere figure of speech. Free trade for the benefit of the working class. Protective duties for the benefit of the working class. Prison reform for the benefit of the working class. This is the last word and the only seriously meant word of bourgeois socialism. It is summed up in the phrase, the bourgeois is a bourgeois, for the benefit of the working class.
Socialist ak ekonomist utopia ak kritik yo. Nou pa prete la sou literati ki nan tout gran revolusyon modern yo. Proklame revendication prolétariat. Premier tentative prolétariat pour te faire passer prolétaire, classe ak différemment, pas résister. Yo te paraît dans moment équitisation générale, côté yo tap déchoqué société féodale là. Léa, prolétariat te nan zé toujours. Conditions matérielles, libération, pas de coassé. Conditions si là yo, c'est celle époque bourgeois qui te ka produire. Littérature révolutionnaire qui te marché avec premier mouvement prolétariat te obligatoire. Gagnons sans réactionnel la caillou. Les pas promettent yon mari senti universel ak yon égalisation sous forme qui pi kriya. Système vétéran socialiste ak communiste yo commencé paraître dans première période dans Z. Dans l'alliance prolétariat ak bourgeois, songez premier parti ya. Bourgeois prolétaire certainement. Fondateur système sa yo, ouais antagoniste qui gagne en classe yo, après l'air ak citron. Mais, Jean yo ouais action élémentaire kap mène société sa depuis en dans. Mais prolétariat qui nan ti moun li toujours pas de paraître yo tankou yon classe qui réellement gagne yon initiative historique ou soit yon mouvement politique autonome. Étant donné antagoniste en classe yo développé même vitesse ak industria, situation économique là, Jean yo well pour qu'on offre conditions matérielles libération prolétariat non plus. Égal yo tombe chercher yon science sociale ensemble ak loi sociale qui t'a pour créer conditions si là. Invention personnelle ça t'a censé remplacer sa mouvement social la pas produit. Condition libération prolétarien yo, c'est l'histoire qui baille, mais yo plutôt râler sorti dans imagination yo. Dans place organisation petit prolétariat en tant que classe, yo vle mette yon organisation société à qui sorti dans tête yo. Yon légende yo créé. Pour yo même l'histoire, l'avenir, le monde réduit dans propagande ak mise en pratique plan société yo. Dans formation plan yo gen conscience c'est intérêt classe qui pi misérable là, classe ouvrière y a défendre principalement, mais c'est uniquement souffrance extrême qui prolétariat esquisé pour yo. Forme sous développement li classe dans ensemble ak propre situation la vie yo. Yo ouais tête yo kon en l'air antagonisme. Classe yo c'est tant kou yon bagay yo pas fin dépasser. Yo vle améliorer existence chaque grain nom qui nan société ya. Mais ça qui pi privilège yo. C'est ça qui fait en général yo tout temps a lancé appel dans direction ensemble société ya sans faire distinction en classe yo. Pire, nous capable dire yo plutôt fait appel à classe qui dominant yo. Parce que d'après yo même depuis yon moun rive comprendre système yo a qui jan pour pas ta fait pas ouais c'est pi bon plan qui pour bay pi bon société possible là. C'est ça que fait yo rejeter toute action politique ak sitou tout aksyon revolusyonè. Yo vle aten bi yo grâce ak moyen pasifik. Pou sa, yo chache louve yon chemin vers nouveau payan limité ki obligatoire. Toujours fin ak échec tableau fantastique sa. Yo inventel nan yon époque côté prolétariat nan ti moun li toujou. Ap imaginel pour position la confusion yo sorti nan premier volonté et scientifique classe la pour yon transformation générale société ya.
But these socialist and communist publications contain also a critical element. They attack every principle of existing society. Hence, they are full of the most valuable materials for the enlightenment of the working class. The practical measures proposed in them, such as the abolition of the distinction between town and country, of the family, of the carrying on of industries for the account of private individuals, and of the wage system, the proclamation of social harmony, the conversion of the functions of the state into a mere superintendence of production, all these proposals point solely to the disappearance of class antagonisms which were at that time only just cropping up, and which in these publications are recognized in their earliest indistinct and undefined forms only. These proposals, therefore, are of a purely utopian character. The significance of critical utopian socialism and communism bears an inverse relation to historical development. In proportion as the modern class struggle develops and takes definite shape, this fantastic standing apart from the contest, these fantastic attacks on it, lose all practical value and all theoretical justification. Therefore, although the originators of these systems were, in many respects, revolutionary, their disciples have, in every case, formed mere reactionary sects. They hold fast by the original views of their masters in opposition to the progressive historical development of the proletariat. They therefore endeavor, and that consistently, to deaden the class struggle and to reconcile the class antagonisms. They still dream of experimental realization of their social utopias, of founding isolated phalansteries, of establishing home colonies, of setting up a little Icaria, duissimo editions of the New Jerusalem, and to realize all these castles in the air. They are compelled to appeal to the feelings and purses of the bourgeois. By degrees, they sink into the category of the reactionary or conservative socialists depicted above, differing from these only by more systematic pedantry and by their fanatical and superstitious belief in the miraculous effects of their social science. They therefore violently oppose all political action on the part of the working class. Such action, according to them, can only result from blind unbelief in the new gospel. The Owenites in England and the Fourierists in France, respectively, opposed the Chartists and the Reformists.
Chapter 4. Position of the Communists in relation to the various existing opposition parties. Section 2 has made clear the relations of the Communists and the existing working class parties, such as the Chartists in England and the agrarian reformers in America. The Communists fight for the attainment of the immediate aims, for the enforcement of the momentary interests of the working class, but in the movement of the present, they also represent and take care of the future of that movement.
In France, the communists ally with the social democrats against the conservative and radical bourgeoisie, reserving, however, the right to take up critical positions in regard to phases and illusions traditionally handed down from the Great Revolution. In Switzerland, they support radicals without losing sight of the fact that this party consists of antagonistic elements, partly of democratic socialists, in the French sense, partly of radical bourgeois. In Poland, they support a party that insists on agrarian revolution as a prime condition for national emancipation. That party which fomented the insurrection of Krakow in 1846. In Germany, they fight with bourgeoisie whenever it acts in a revolutionary way, against the absolute monarchy, the feudal squirearchy, and the petty bourgeoisie. But they never cease for a single instant to instill into the working class the clearest possible recognition of the hostile antagonism between bourgeoisie and proletariat, in order that the German workers may straightway use, as so many weapons against the bourgeoisie, the social and political conditions that the bourgeoisie must necessarily introduce along with its supremacy, and in order that, after the fall of the reactionary classes in Germany, the fight against the bourgeoisie itself may immediately begin. The communists turned their attention chiefly to Germany because the country is on the eve of bourgeois revolution that is bound to be carried out under more advanced conditions of European civilization and with a much more developed proletariat than that of England was in the 17th and France in the 18th century. And because bourgeois revolution in Germany will be but the prelude to an immediately following proletariat revolution. In short, the communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. In all these movements, they bring to the front, as the leading question in each, the property question, no matter what its degree of development at the time. Finally, they labor everywhere for the union and agreement of the democratic parties of all countries.
The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that the ends could be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions.
Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Workers of the world, unite!